More than 1 million Algerian women and men take to the streets of the capital.
Ce jeudi, ce sont les avocats et les journalistes qui ont défilé contre la candidature de l'actuel président.
Abdelaziz Bouteflika will not be seeking a fifth term.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Down, but not quite out. The question Algerians are asking is, when will they see the end of their longtime president? A mass shooting in New Zealand and the ethics of graphic imagery. What should and should not be shown online and on air.
My beauty.
Purpose advertising. Those feel-good ads designed to make you feel good about buying something. And
I'll be living on my trust fund underneath the hot sun.
Brexit Britain is burning, and the politician who set it alight is profiting at a safe distance. 3 weeks into mass political protests, Algeria's President Abdelaziz Bouteflika has given in, withdrawing his bid for a fifth term in office. The announcement did not come from Bouteflika himself. The 82-year-old has hardly been seen in public since a stroke 6 years ago left him paralyzed. For now, Algeria's invisible ruler remains in office. His indefinite postponement of next month's election suggests he might not be going anytime soon. Algeria's social media space has been occupied by protesters, driving the street movement, providing their own coverage of it. Citizens have learned not to count on media aligned with the government, especially broadcasters. They've long been controlled by the state. Criticism of the ailing ruler had been scarce there. However, things are changing. Marginalized voices, many of them banned from the airwaves, are being heard once again. Reporters at state-backed outlets have been criticizing the journalism of their own channels. Could this really be the beginning of the end for a president who's been in power for nearly 20 years? Our starting point this week is Algiers. Sunday, March 4th. The evening newscast on Canal Algerie, a French-language channel that stayed on.
Madame, Monsieur, bonsoir.
For the Algerian media, it would be a telling moment. For the woman who had spent 15 years in the anchor chair, the last straw. Nadia Madassi reads a letter from President Bouteflika, word for word, addressing the unrest on the streets.
La nouvelle république et du nouveau système algérien. C'était là la lettre.
Then she turned to news of an opposition figure, a voice of dissent, announcing his intention to run for Bouteflika's job.
She was reading, going through her newscast, and was going to read an item about one of the other candidates, and she was clearly told on her earpiece, "Don't read that."
Ali Rderish, candidat indépendant.
Like practices straight out of the Soviet Union.
Looking at her body language, she was really in a very weird position, and she expressed that so much. And just after the TV show, she resigned from that position and said, enough is enough.
It was another reminder that you don't live in a free country. You are under the thumb of a regime that controls what your visual cortex sees. And that is an outrageous thing for someone to feel in the 21st century, in the borderless world of the internet, where ideas are moving across.
The demonstrations began a month ago in northern Algeria, far from the capital. They were set off by the news that President Bouteflika would seek an unprecedented and unconstitutional fifth term in office. Within a week, the protests had reached Algiers. Organized on and driven by social media, the unrest quickly grew to a level the country has not seen in decades. Initially, the state-owned channels Canal Algerie and UNTV both buried their heads in the sand, ignoring the story. However, 4 days into the protests in the capital, on February 26th, journalists held one of their own over the orders that they were getting from above, preventing them from doing their job.
That was a pretty significant moment in that journalists were basically saying this is not acceptable, and were able to act on that. Whereas previously, you know, that step maybe wouldn't have been taken. And The extent to which civil society really was mobilizing in support of the movement kind of caught the regime off guard, and that response, by just trying to ignore the news, simply wasn't going to fly.
Since the beginning of the protest on February 22nd, journalists and media had very formal, guidelines not to cover the protest, and they didn't at the beginning. Algerian TV were having, several TV shows, cartoons, and documentaries, and there was no coverage whatsoever about what was going on in the Algerian street. When I marched with the student in the University of Ben Aknoun in Algiers on February 26, one of the slogans were "Ya Sahafa win kunti al-barah," which means you media, where did you go?
It was very significant that on the evening that Bouteflika returned to Algiers, the main national TV channel opted for this very unusual format of an open debate between a couple of fairly major, well-known Algerian figures on the current political crisis within the country. And they evoked openly, the question of crisis, the question of a transition. It was taken by a lot of Algerians as a sign that things were moving from only a few days before, when they'd been trying not to talk about the protests at all.
Every war results in casualties, and the battle for truth in Algeria has produced a few. Merwan Lounas spent 12 years hosting a program on a state-owned radio channel, RAI. His show was cancelled this past week because he did not choose his words carefully enough. And Lounas did not even speak directly on the protests or the politics. His crime was speaking philosophically, allegorically.
The subject of this episode was the theory of social contract. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau says that people are the source of power, and that a nation cannot be built without its people. I concentrated on this philosophical point. The director of the channel thought I was talking about the current movement, even though I didn't directly refer to it or take any particular political stance. Certain people in public media do not understand the transformation happening in Algerian society today and still behave with a controlling mentality, a mentality that is outdated. The people-led demonstrations have proven that this mentality belongs in the past.
Our interview with Lounas was conducted over Skype because Al Jazeera has effectively been banned from Algeria since 2004. The Bouteflika government is very selective about which international news outlets it will allow in, limiting some to visits by foreign leaders or other stories the authorities want covered. And the on-the-ground absence of global news organizations may have contributed to some of the misconceptions swirling around this story, starting with the lazy labeling of the protests as Algeria's version of the Arab Spring, given that they're describing a population that rose up against one-party rule in 1988, more than 2 decades before their neighbors did.
Look, we respect what happened in other countries, but we are in another concept. We started our revolution in 1988. We had our first free election in 1991, when the Arab world was really in a totally different situation.
Algeria had a free press, vibrant democracy, free speech, a renaissance and bubbling of creativities in the arts and the culture. All of that ended when the elections got cancelled and when the Islamists won, and the bloody civil war that ensued after.
So now people don't even like the term Arab Spring. They just say this is our liberation movement, which is continuing, with all due respect to what happened in other countries.
Algeria was a precursor in the Arab Spring, and this is why Algerians do not like the analogy, because of what happened after the Arab Spring in the region: terrorism, jihadism, Daesh, terrible socio-economic situation, and they don't want that for their country. Algerians feel that they paid a hefty price after their Algerian Spring in 1988 and what followed.
Having been through such an uprising before, having then watched their neighbors do the same, Algerians have fewer illusions than most. They know what has not changed, that President Bouteflika, while out of sight, is still in the picture, that the powers that be, known as le pouvoir, who have backed the president for so long, are still there. Algerians also know, that their news media, which are showing signs of life, could revert to old habits at any time. We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, MARCELA PIZARRO. MARCELA, the mass murders that took place at those two mosques in New Zealand, it was clear that the perpetrators wanted to attract attention and that they relied on live streaming technology to get it.
That's right, Richard, because there were 17 minutes of video live streamed on Facebook and then reposted on 3 other major platforms. The suspect also published his white supremacist manifesto on 8chan, an American website where users can create their own storyboards. This tweet by Washington Post reporter Drew Harwell, who specializes in artificial intelligence, summed up the problem. The New Zealand massacre was live streamed on Facebook, announced on 8chan, reposted on YouTube, commentated about on Reddit, and mirrored around the world before the tech companies could even react. Those platforms then scrambled to take the material down, but 8 hours later, the full video was still up on YouTube.
And as all of this is unfolding online, there are news organizations around the world with some editorial decisions to make.
Various media outlets broadcast some of the footage or embedded it on their websites and posts, including several in Australia and Al Jazeera Arabic. In most cases, they didn't show the actual shootings or any victims. They limited their videos to the moment the government entered the mosque. The British paper, the Daily Mail, took it further. Now, bear in mind the site is driven by advertising and for a time allowed viewers to watch the video in full. As New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern put it, we should not be perpetuating, sharing, giving any oxygen to this act of violence and the message that is sitting behind it.
On to Venezuela now, the political power struggle there, the ongoing propaganda war, and one piece of video that made news and then made news again.
Yes, so a video emerged a few weeks back showing trucks carrying humanitarian aid ablaze. And it was aired by news networks around the world as evidence that President Maduro's forces were setting aid on fire. Problem is, the video was doctored. This week, the New York Times took a forensic look at those images and showed how the trucks had been, in fact, set alight not by Maduro's forces, but by a protester who threw a Molotov cocktail that hit one of the vehicles.
He launches one Molotov, but the second one separates.
The Times then traces how the doctored video spread like wildfire. US politicians took to Twitter with it, and news networks regurgitated it without checking its legitimacy.
So then this then becomes a story about some good fact-checking on the part of the New York Times.
It does, but by the time that Times piece was published, the misinformation had had plenty of time to spread. That could have easily been avoided because there were, in fact, many journalists on the ground on day one who questioned the video. But their doubts failed to make the newscasts. It's taken 2 weeks for the Times to set the record straight.
Okay, thanks, Marcela. Turning now to an advertising trend and a social media story that probably came up on your news feeds recently, that Gillette ad that landed the company in some hot water. Jumping on the Me Too hashtag and subsequent movement to protect women from sexual harassment in the workplace, Gillette tweaked its longtime sales slogan, "The best a man can get," turning it into "the best that men can be." And then the company got beat up online for appropriating a social movement for the sake of its profits. That advertising technique has a name. It's called purpose marketing. It's a socio-political kind of brand messaging that adopts a purpose in order to sell a product. In the 21st century marketplace, traditional product-focused campaigns no longer get the clicks, the likes, the shares that advertisers crave. So more and more of them are latching onto causes. And Gillette's not the only brand to have an ad of this kind backfire. The Listening Post's Johanna Hoos now on a marketing trend and the challenge of striking a balance between purpose and profit.
Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything.
Racial equality.
My beauty.
My beauty.
My beauty.
My say. Female empowerment.
This is what happens when ice cream is just 2 degrees warmer than it should be.
The realities of climate change.
Bullying.
The Me Too movement against sexual harassment.
Masculinity.
For big brands, just selling a product is no longer enough.
Is this the best a man can get?
Advertising doesn't work like it used to,
and getting people's attention is really difficult. Companies can't just talk about what they make anymore because we've seen it before and we're not paying attention. So what so many brands are doing is show up with conversations that we want to be part of, and if they can go along for the ride, that's the best route available to them.
We're experiencing a shift in generational values, and what that's leading to is younger people in particular looking to buy from and work for companies that are more conscientious, that consider the bigger picture. What young people can see is rising inequality, increased political polarizations, and because of this there is a need for businesses to consider more than just profit.
Not something they've ever been particularly good at.
He said.
They said.
She said. I said, no way.
Which begs the question, the socio-political causes companies pick, the stances they take, do they amount to anything more than on-screen publicity stunts, strategically adopted to draw the clicks, the likes, the shares their businesses rely on? In the case of Pepsi, the answer seems to be no. In 2017, the company put out an ad appropriating the Black Lives Matter movement to sell its product. But it backfired and has since been held up as a prime example of how not to do purpose marketing. Because Pepsi attempted to challenge decades of police brutality and racial inequality with a can of soda and a supermodel, a white one.
So we have a serious issue here that's meaningful to people, and they belittled it by using one of the most wealthy women in the world as their spokesmodel. It makes it seem trite and certainly opportunistic. It didn't seem authentic. It seemed like just glomming onto a cause, and it really rang false for people who care about those issues.
At no point, I guess, have Pepsi ever intimated through their advertising or marketing that they're aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement. And because of that, the ad was seen as reductive, making a pop culture moment out of protest against police brutality.
We've seen one after another disastrous outcome of brands that try to, use fake purpose opportunistically to connect with consumers, and it backfires.
Pepsi is not the only brand trying to master the art of purpose marketing.
It's been going on far too long.
In January this year, razor brand Gillette, famous for its longtime slogan, "The best a man can get," switched up its catchphrase to ride the Me Too wave, releasing its "The Best Man Can Be" campaign, aimed at addressing toxic masculinity and hoping to sell a few razors in the process.
Because we believe in the best in men.
The ad caused a huge backlash, not least because Gillette's newfound moral compass is somewhat of a departure from the message the company has spread for decades.
To say the right thing, to act the right way.
So let's think about Gillette's history for a minute. They are one of the very first mass marketers.
The Gillette Cavalcade of Sports is on the air.
Gillette showed up in our living rooms uninvited for years and years at a time, promoting the idea that what a man is supposed to do is beat another man senseless. So if Gillette shows up today in a world where they can't buy our attention and seeks to earn it by putting a message into the world, yeah, you can be a cynic and say they're trying to manipulate us, but what I see is a heartfelt effort to say, let's think about this.
So I think the reason why there was such backlash to this is because it came off like Gillette was lecturing and tisk-tisking men for not being the right kind of father, the right kind of man. I think what they meant to be was aspirational, like let's be better.
Because the boys watching today,
but they did it so badly,
will be the men of tomorrow.
It came off as opportunistic, like they were just trying to find a cause and, oh, this one will do.
What is unhelpful is flash in the pan type of activity. What you want to see is a brand or a business really believe in a cause and commit to supporting it over a period of time. Brands can really make a difference using the power that they have through their platforms and their resources, and use it to shift mindsets and address social challenges and call out injustice. And in doing that, brands can help issues move on a lot more quickly than they would have done without that kind of exposure.
Daniel Brindis agrees. He works at Greenpeace in charge of campaigning for forestry. Last year, a British supermarket chain, Iceland, approached the organisation wanting to use one of its campaign videos for an ad on the consequences of the farming of dirty palm oil, destroying natural habitats.
There's orangutan in my bedroom and I don't know what to do. She plays with all my teddies and keeps borrowing my shoe.
Greenpeace allowed Iceland to use the video, and while the UK regulator responsible for vetting ads banned it for allegedly breaking the rules of political advertising, it went viral and reignited discussions over the consequences of deforestation.
Why were you in my bedroom? I really want to know. There's a human in my forest, and I don't know what to do.
At Greenpeace, we often say no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. So if a company is doing the right thing and taking positive action that is genuine, deserves visibility and deserves praise. Greenpeace UK approached this with cynicism and with scrutiny, and the fact is that they felt like the actions on the part of Iceland represented a legitimate investment in trying to address the problem. They sent their CEO to go to Indonesia and see firsthand the scale of the problem with dirty palm oil production.
He took away my mother, and I'm scared.
When brands do get it right, they can prove a useful ally in the fight for social justice. And it's not bad for profits either. Following the ad, Iceland's sales rose and its brand perception amongst consumers improved significantly.
Calling a dream crazy is not an insult.
Similarly, a commercial produced by sports brand Nike, featuring NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who lost his job taking a stance on racial inequality, put the Black Lives Matter movement back in the spotlight.
So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
And at the same time, the company saw its share price shoot up.
Nike's ad was the voice of someone actively engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement. That gave the ad a lot more authenticity, but still it's important to ask questions about businesses' broader practices and Nike's working conditions and the practices in Asia are something that still need to be questioned.
At the same time that Nike is coming out championing women athletes and saying they should stand up and, you know, growl and make noise.
So if they want to call you crazy, fine. Show them what crazy can do.
They have class action lawsuit for, you know, underpaying their female employees. We don't hear that. What we hear is all the marketing noise around the cause of championing women. As consumers, you don't have to, it's not your job to fully understand an issue, which means you may not be hearing the whole issue.
Everyone is different.
One measure of how far this trend in marketing has come, it's now reached a point of being satirized.
Imagine if a single bottle could be enjoyed by 2 people.
From the same bottle at the same time.
So we've got to drink from it together.
Together? Are you okay with that?
It's fine.
Oasis, the soft drink company, produced this ad and calls it refreshingly honest on what the true purpose of purpose marketing really is.
Harmony. Just a few billion sales away. Not in shops, doesn't fit on shelves.
And finally, history will not treat him kindly, but we at the Listening Post figure, why wait? We're talking about David Cameron, the politician who basically fled 10 Downing Street after calling that Brexit referendum, losing it, and leaving the new Prime Minister, Theresa May, to clean up his mess. This past week, Parliament rejected May's blueprint to quit the European Union. Cameron was nowhere to be seen. These days, he delivers speeches for which he is reportedly grotesquely overpaid, around $200,000 an hour. What are those speeches about? Brexit. Here's a video made by joe.co.uk, a site that says it's aimed at men, not lads. It features a tune by George Ezra, reworked, called David Cameron Has This Important Message from Nice. We'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
Where is the geezer? Brexit instigator, see you later. Gonna hit the road. Gotta hit that road. Something changed in the atmosphere when I split the nation, so I disappeared. I'm gonna be blamed for this mess. Time flies by when I'm living nicked up and you're dying in austerity. But now I'm chillaxing round the clock on holiday in peace with my doctors up. I can get used to this. I'll be living on my trust fund underneath the hot sun, forgetting that I'm someone who held a referendum that divided the nation and broke the United Kingdom.